Medical workers of Reddit, what were the most haunting last words you've heard from a patient? It wasn't words. But the most haunting death was a patient who was DNR. Through her and her family's wishes. She was losing her battle. And her family wasn't there. She was getting frantic and looking around and half sitting up in bed. And a nurse with more experience than me took her hand and calmly said, "It's okay. You are not alone. We're right here with you. It's okay to leave." The patient immediately calmed, put her head back on the pillow and died. I knew I wanted to be that nurse when I grew up. How the hell did she know just what to do and say? I've never forgotten it. When I was a senior resident, a young man, late 20s, was admitted for pneumonia. He got worse quickly and I was called to his room to help while on call that night. He was having trouble breathing and needed intubated. I explained all this to him and that I would sedate him and then get him intubated so we could help him breathe. He agreed and we got everything ready. The last thing he said to me was, "Doc, please don't let me die." I told him I would do my very best. I got him intubated and transferred to the ICU. A few weeks later I was on call covering the ICU and he was barely hanging on. I knew he would not make it through the night. He went into VFID several times and I was able to bring him back. But only briefly. He was just too sick and he died shortly after that. It was horrible talking to his mother and girlfriend and comforting them knowing the last words he ever spoke were to me saying, "Please don't let me die." I was visiting my grandpa and had to leave town and go back to medical school. And I told him I loved him and would see him later. He told me he loved me too. But no, I won't. He was right. He died a week later of pneumonia. AWW. My great grandma told us something similar to this. We went to Mexico for her birthday. When we were saying our goodbyes, she told us the next time we'd be in town would be when she was 6 feet under. She was right. Not the very last words. But I had a patient in her early 20s who was severely thrombocytopenic and bleeding profusely for days ask me if she was going to make it. I had to look her in the eyes and tell her there is a good chance she wouldn't. I thought she would bust into tears but no. She just kind of sat back and accepted it. I think she already knew. She died shortly after I got off shift. I'm an intern at a home for patients with Alzheimer's and have only been there for a few weeks. The first patient to pass during my internship said, "Who am I?" For some reason it saddens me deeply and I can't seem to let it go. Not a medical worker. But when I was 14 my friends and I were joking around before our 7th period theater class. My one friend, who was always a big goof, was playing along with a joke that he and another classmate were breaking up and said, "This relationship is over." Then spun around and fell to the floor for dramatic effect. Except it wasn't for dramatic effect. Because he actually suffered heart failure and died instantly from an unknown condition, acute myocarditis. None of us realized it and laughed along. I even picked up his glasses from the floor and put them on to tease him about how blind he was. When I tried to give him his glasses back I was struck by how discolored his face was. And then blood began to pour from his mouth. That's when the screaming started. Absolutely ducked me as a 14-year-old to realize we could all just drop dead at any moment. It's not words that haunt me. It's the last few agonal breaths. Gasping and gurgling. Before they are gone. I still remember the first patient I lost as we stood by as per patient family request. Haunting. Not a medical worker. But my friend's husband was dying from cancer. He'd done lots of chemo and one surgery and overall his prognoses looked really good. He'd gone through another surgery. And he was due to be released from the hospital a couple days after this story takes place. My friend had been with him and was going back home to sleep for the night. Just before she left his room, he said, "I'm going to miss you my love," and obviously she thinks nothing of it. Saying, "I'll miss you too. I'll be back in the morning." Couple hours later he was gone. Nurse, in hospital caring for 40-ish man with brain tumor. Coming in and out of consciousness. Not to be resuscitated. His 16-year-old daughter was crying non-stop for 12 hours. His wife, who had been given a few months to prepare herself, was calm and focused on her husband. I had to routinely check his level of consciousness, which involved talking to him in a loud voice, responds to auditory stimulation, which I did not like to do. So I asked his wife to do the loud voice part, so the voice he would hear would be hers, not mine. And she did so without hesitation. The only response we observed with her vocalization was that this by now profoundly unconscious patient took her hand to his lips and kissed it. He stopped breathing very soon after that. I am haunted, but not in a bad way. A teenage girl who was having an asthma attack while she was at someone's house she wasn't supposed to be at. My mom's gonna heal me : she died at the hospital. Sweet guy in his 20s with endocarditis, heart valve infection, caused by IV drug abuse. I was prepping him for his third open heart surgery when he sat up, looked me in the eye, and said, "I'm going to die. Aren't I?" He did not survive the surgery. I'm gonna duck your love. Old man who never attended his dialysis appointments. A few hours later we had a fire right by his former room. So despite not being all that worrying at the time, he definitely was the only one that followed through on actually haunting us. My buddy who went on to be a doctor had an elderly female patient, probably 90-100 years old. Her daughter left the room to get coffee and my buddy had to check on her vitals. They were normal. Then she woke up, smiled and got teary-eyed. She said, "I knew you'd come back for me. I'm sorry I didn't marry you. My family won't let me. But I will now. I promise." My buddy just held her hand and smiled. She laid back and closed her eyes and her heart stopped. She had a DNR and was gone just like that. Her daughter had no clue what she meant. Her husband had been dead for 10 years and they were married since they were 20. My buddy doesn't know if it's relevant, but we are black and maybe she was in love with a black guy a long time ago, because she was looking right at him when she spoke. IDK. She's weird. I was with my father as he lay dying in the hospital. It was a long and emotionally exhausting process, so we kids took turns sitting with him and holding his hand for when he would wake up. He was in and out of lucidity, but just before he went he opened his eyes, gripped my hand hard, looked me in the eye and said, "I don't like that guy in the black suit sitting over in the corner." My blood ran cold and I quickly looked over my shoulder and there was an empty chair there. I don't know if he was remembering some incident from his past, hallucinating, or if he saw someone more sinister. I didn't mention it to my siblings for years and even since then they don't like to talk about it. I was about 5 or 6 when my grandfather was on his deathbed. The last thing he did was put his hand on my shoulder and said, "No wonder you never liked my spicy food." And then he passed about 10 seconds later. We were all super confused. About 3 months later I almost died from suffocation after eating some salsa. At the hospital I was diagnosed with a capsaicin allergy, spicy food. To this day it still creeps me out. No one knew I was allergic before then. And I didn't show any signs either. I work as a PA for a clinic, so I'll never be involved in that situation, but I know a friend who has been. She is also a PA and was helping a guy who was terminally ill. Before he passed he asked her to not let his wife have his sheet. Of course she listens and is sympathetic. A day or so after he passed, his ex-wife apparently shows up to the hospital with several kids saying she is in this guy's will. Long story short, she was trying to take his sheet. Less haunting and more just sad because of how young he was and how he was unaware of his final moments. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Wasn't his last words, but last words he said to me. I am an EMT, and we had a frequent patient, almost once a week. He was a huge big dig, but towards the end he turned into a sweet and appreciative man. We were in his house, which what ended up being out last day there. He knew it. I didn't. He said, "Can I just have a beer before we leave for the hospital?" I didn't let him have it. I should have. Not my patient but a friend of mine. He had a patient with a AAA abdominal aortic aneurysm. Your aorta is bulging and throbbing about ready to pop. The pain is very severe and agonizing, and if it does rupture, the pain immediately goes away and feels so good, but your chances of survival are pretty much non-existent even if you are prepped on the operating table when it ruptures. Anyways, he had a 15-year-old with one, and on the way to the hospital she looks at him and just says, "Oh, that feels so much better," and died about 10 seconds later. Student: Sir, are you in any pain? Patient: the duck kind of dumbest question is that. I just got ducking stabbed. Duck: yeah, I'm in pain. He died within minutes. Not a medical worker, but I knew a guy from middle school who had a degenerative disease and he knew he'd die young. It was New Year's Eve and he'd just gotten out of the hospital for the 3rd time in a few months, so we were partying at his apartment. Somehow I ended up being the last person there with him and his girlfriend, and we were pretty drunk and got to talking for a while about how great the party was. How much nice it was to have friends like ours. Plans for the future. All of a sudden he said, "God, I wish I had more time. I always thought I'd have more time." Not his last words, but they are the ones that stuck with me. We weren't close by any stretch, but I always wished he had more time too. He was so friendly and kind. The type of person who made you feel like their closest friend even if you were a total stranger. He was a good man and he deserved a longer life. Paramedic here. I was transporting a cardiac patient, and while we were both watching my EKG monitor, he went into fib. A lethal heart rhythm. His heart stopped pumping blood effectively at that point, but there was enough blood pressure for a few seconds of consciousness. He looked at me and said, "But I don't see the light," and went unconscious. Coded him. Shocked him a few times. Meds by the handful. But he died. Not a healthcare worker, but my grandfather passed this week at 89 years old. He was a very sharp, sane man. Not senile or any dementia. The 2 days leading to his passing he began to see things. He told me, "Do you see Michelangelo painting?" I said no. He said, "He's painting invisible dust. Everything he paints disappears. I hope the bathroom is still there." He also told us he could see little men jumping from the fan blades. It was really strange. It sounded like he was tripping acid, but obviously he wasn't. He prayed over and over the night before he passed. We found him deceased in the morning. When I was training, I had a guy go into a massive cardiac arrest. We ended up working on him for over an hour and a half because we kept getting him back then losing him again. He had wet himself during the arrest, which is common. It happens, and he just kept apologizing for making a mess. Had a patient that kept coding. But every time they came back they'd get crazy strong. Fight everyone. And then start saying the Lord's Prayer. They'd trail off and code again. Another one snatched me by the arm and pleaded that they wanted to see their baby grow up. 60 seconds later I was pumping away on their chest. In my line of work I hear a lot of last words. These two, though, surprisingly weren't the final last words. I just thought they were, and at the time it was a perfectly rational thought. Of last words, my favorites were always the "I want you to go away and leave me alone. I'm going to sleep. Goodbye." Family members didn't pick up on that one. But that patient and his eyes said it all. Edit. Code equals code blue equals heart stopped breathing equals dead. Not a medical worker, but first responder qualified at the time. I found a guy lying on the street I sort of knew but didn't recognize them. Reeked of alcohol and smelled rotten. I grabbed his hand and tried to talk to him and see what was going on. What happened? If he was in pain. etc. He looked at me and said, "Diane, I didn't expect to see you here." He cried a bit and stopped breathing soon after that. Diane was his late wife. He was dead before the ambulance got there. And my attempts at CPR didn't work. I feel bad for the EMTs because I might have blamed them for taking too long. Might get buried. I was taking care of this guy with stage 4 cancer who had altered mental status. No cancer in the brain on imaging. Couldn't find out what was wrong. Was getting worse. Made comfort care. Morning that he died he actually looked better and said, "Hey doc, I'm scared, can we talk about this?" And I said sure. I'll come back after rounds. My plan was to come back after lunch to talk with him. On my way down to get food, my pager goes off saying that the patient had died. He was scared of dying. He wanted someone to talk to. He died terrified. Really my only regret of my career so far. Not me, but my auntie likes to tell this story a lot. She was with a patient and they got told, nicely, that they had 2 weeks left to live. The patient looked to my auntie and then said the date, the 12th of October. It was July, and my auntie was very confused of why he said that. Anyway, he passed about a week later. My auntie put that date in her calendar. Highly encouraged. Expecting that nothing would happen, but then on the 12th of October, a patient came in with a severe illness and said, "Other patient's name has said you've been expecting me to this day." This freaks me out and I DK what happened or how this happened, but I'm freaking scared to death that we're in fact living as a simulation. Don't let my mom come in. I don't want she to see me crying. She was 16. I wasn't prepared for that. Got broke like glass. About 12 years ago we got some really bad news. My brother, who had an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder, took the news really bad. He got really sick and the next day he passed away. His last words were, "It's broken, it's broken." My little brother was with him and he said, "It's okay, I fixed it." Then he fell asleep and died. I think he was talking about his heart. I truly believed he died of a broken heart. It haunts me every day. Multi-gunshot wound in the trauma bay that had lost a lot of blood that we took back for an emergent slap. Girl was in her mid-20s and before we took her she just kept asking me over and over again for her mom. She died early on the next morning.